Um, I just want to take a second. I'll introduce my colleague Laura Trupin now, and we're going to share the talk. And Laura is a epidemiologist biostatistician with the California Labor Lab. She has a long and distinguished career looking at the relationship between work and health, and also looking at inequities in health outcomes for people with severe chronic disease. Um, and she is the academic coordinator for the California Labor Lab, and the fact that we were able to get off the ground so well is in part a testament to the work that she's done. So without further ado, I will segue to our talk. I have no financial issues or relationships disclosed, nor does Laura. So the California Work and Health Survey combines features of comprehensive labor market and health surveys to study the relationship of work to health. In other countries, they have one statistical agency. The fact that we have separate labor market and health statistical agencies has advantages, but also has disadvantages. The survey also expands the scope of the inquiry to include a greater number of jobs, including secondary jobs of many workers and those who've worked in the past month instead of just a week, which is what the standard labor market surveys capture. It improves items related to emergent working conditions and potential misclassifications of workers, something to which Lorena alluded. It documents the prevalence of impact of alternative contingent employment, especially for marginalized workers. So axes of emerging working conditions in the California lab, these are our working definitions of what our focus is. It's the use of alternative employment arrangements, which include independent contracting, on-call work, being employed by a temp agency, and having work subcontract out. It's the use of contingent forms of employment. It's the erosion of working conditions, the things that Lorena and her predecessors have fought for, but have since eroded. So loss of workplace benefits and protections that arose in the 20th century, including formal ways of providing workers voices. So the California Work and Health Survey sampled California adults ages 18 to 70, and was conducted finishing about a year ago. All contact was initiated with phone calls to potential respondents. The surveys, however, were completed by either phone interview or self-administered web platform. Random digit dialing sample of cell phone numbers was done, including regular and to capture low-income groups prepaid plans. Smartphones are almost ubiquitous in the target population, covering 98% of the working age population. Our results are weighted to the California population. So the survey participation, it's very hard work to get 4,000 respondents, and we had to call, or our contractor had to call 135,000 people to get to that number, but we did ultimately get to 4,000. For those of you who are methods freaks, the real contact, we successfully reached 26% of the people whom we contacted successfully. So in this slide, we looked at the employment status of the 27 million Californians who are these working ages. 72% were in the labor market in the week prior to our interviewing them. Of those, 67% worked that week. We expanded that to include the prior month. 71% worked in the prior month, 80% worked in the 12 months prior to interview, and 98% had ever worked. Californians do a lot of work. The number of jobs held by working age Californians, 22% of them hold 2 or more jobs. In fact, 7% hold 3 or more jobs. We had a respondent who had 9 jobs, talking about the gig economy in the month prior to interview. A minority of working-age Californians work full-time for the entire year. More than a fifth work part-time for only part of the year. So it's not exactly a full-time full-year employment situation for the bulk of Californians. What's interesting, though, is more than a fifth of Californians work more than full-time, which we defined as at least 35 hours a week for 47 weeks or more in a year. Because of the methodological advances from the California Work and Health Survey, both from expanding the time frame from the past week to the past month and the scope of inquiry from main to second jobs, we vastly increased the yield of different kinds of workers. Among all employed, the number counted as employed increased by 6%. Among independent contractors, 35% more were identified. Other forms of alternative work, 26%. App-based work, 42% more, and contingent workers, 46% more. The prevalence of independent contracting and app-based and contingent employment is higher in second jobs. You can see this. Among independent contractors, almost half are in among those with a second job, 45% are independent contractors. There was no difference in the other forms of alternative employment, the second set of columns. Still, and this is really critical, the majority of non-traditional work is performed as a main job. Looking at independent contractors, we identified 4.8 million of them, but over 3 million of them, it's their main job. And the same holds for the other kinds of employment, which we document here. If one message goes home today from our talk, perhaps this is the message. For many people, it's the way they earn their living in their main job. We found no gender difference in the prevalence of independent contracting, contingent employment, or app-based work, but men were more likely than women to do other forms of alt work. There were no consistent differences in the kinds of employment by race or ethnicity, but it's popcorning all over the place depending on the kind of work. But we did find that older workers were more likely to be independent contractors. Younger workers were more likely to be in other forms of alt work and app-based work, and contingent employment was more common in both the youngest and oldest workers. So it seems like when people are first gaining a foothold and about to exit the labor force, they're more likely to hold contingent jobs. Higher levels of education were associated with lower rates of all forms of non-standard employment. And this, again, is something that Lorena addressed. We sometimes think of independent contractors as Hollywood screenwriters and the like, but in fact, for all of these forms, the higher levels of education were associated with lower rates, not higher rates. Those born outside of the US were slightly more likely to report other forms of alternative and app-based work, and no difference in the other forms of employment. People with disabilities were slightly more likely to be independent contractors, to do app-based work, and have contingent employment, suggesting a degree of vulnerability that relegates them to this kind of work. So I am going to turn it over to Laura to take from here to the rest, and she will document the impact of these kinds of employment on the well-being of the workforce.
Hi, everyone. Sharing my screen. All right. Thanks, Ed. So I will be looking at these forms of non-standard employment in relation to California's economic well-being, their health status, and working conditions that may put them at risk for future health consequences. Yeah. There we go. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. They're rampant. Okay, here I am. So looking first at the economic circumstances of the whole of the California working age population that we covered in the survey, here separated by employment status. So we see that, of course, lower earnings, lower household income, and poverty are all more common among those who aren't working. We do see substantial fractions of the working population who have individual earnings or household income below 40,000 and whose household income puts them at or below 125% of the federal poverty level. And given these findings, it's not surprising that many working Californians are facing financial strain. They have difficulty making ends meet. They can't come up with an unexpected $400 expense, and they consider themselves at risk of hardships in basic necessities, food, housing, and medical care in the coming months. Again, we see that food stamps or SNAP and the use of food banks are pretty common among working Californians, smaller numbers receiving SSI, and temporary assistance to needy families or TANF. During the survey year and the year prior to the survey, about 5% of both working and non-working Californians reported receiving unemployment benefits in the survey. This is likely impacted by the COVID shutdown. Turning now to the economic well-being of workers in various kinds of non-standard employment. This first slide shows the economic status for independent contractors, for other types of alternative workers, which includes temp agency workers, on-call, and subcontracted workers, in comparison to those not in alternative arrangements, which are shown in the lightest blue bars. Independent contractors and other alternative workers were much more likely to report low earnings, low household income, and to live in poverty than the rest of the employed population. We see a similar pattern for app-based workers shown on the set of bars that's on the left, and contingent workers on the right. Both groups were much more likely to have poor economic circumstances. And financial strain was also more common among independent contractors and other alternative workers, with both groups reporting difficulty living on their income and at risk of near-term financial hardships. Once again, this pattern continues, with both app-based and contingent workers showing significantly more evidence of financial strain. In each group, more than 40% report difficulty living on their income. Benefit recipiency varied by alternative work arrangements as well. Independent contractors were more likely to receive TANF and SNAP than non-alternative workers, and those in other alternative arrangements were also more likely to receive TANF. And the results were somewhat more dramatic for the app-based workers, who were 5 times as likely as other workers to have received TANF during the year, and almost twice as likely to have received SNAP or to go to a food bank. Contingent workers were also more likely to use food stamps or a food bank. Now we're going to turn to looking briefly at physical and mental health status, as well as health insurance. We see little difference by alternative work arrangements for either physical or mental health status, but both independent contractors and other alternative workers are less likely to have health insurance, whether it be through an employer or through another source. Health status also isn't different for app-based workers compared to others, but contingent workers are more likely to report fair or poor mental health. And both forms of non-standard work are associated with more than a 2-fold increase in lacking health insurance. So this last series of slides I'll be showing looks at working conditions, particularly those which have been shown to elevate risks for serious chronic illness and injury. This first slide looks at the rate of high levels of ergonomic demands, such as lifting, using vibrating tools, repetitive motions, and also high levels of cognitive demands, which would be concentration, interacting with people, using computers. Independent contractors and other alternative workers are both more likely to have high physical demands and less likely to have high levels of cognitive demands. High levels of physical and demands are also more common among app-based workers, and both groups are less likely to have high cognitive demands. Looking at shift work, we know that working irregular shifts, including rotating, split, or variable time, has been associated with a range of poor physical and mental health outcomes. We see this more commonly among independent contractors and other alternative workers. Flexible hours, which can be seen as a benefit, they're more common among independent contractors, which would be expected given the nature of that type of employment. App-based workers have both more irregular shifts and also more flexible hours, which goes along with that kind of work, while irregular shifts are also more common among contingent workers. Finally, we looked at the concept that's termed job strain, in which a worker has a great deal of demands put on them, whether they have to work fast, not having breaks, without having control over their work. This has been associated with long-term risks of cardiovascular disease, musculoskeletal injury, and mental health outcomes. Independent contractors are less likely to report this kind of job strain, while other alternative workers and those in contingent jobs are more likely to report it. So looking back over all the results that Ed and I have just presented, we see that a lot of non-standard work, i.e., alternative, app-based, or contingent employment, is missing in surveys that only look at the main job held in the past week, which is the typical way that labor market surveys are asked. These kinds of arrangements are much more common in second jobs and episodic work. However, as Ed pointed out, because most people work at only one job at a time, the large majority of jobs with non-standard arrangements are the respondents' main employment. Also, those with more education and presumably more choices in their employment opportunities are less likely to have any of these non-standard employment arrangements. And we see that among the substantial proportion of working Californians reporting poor economic circumstances and financial strain, they are more likely to be employed in non-standard arrangements. The association between public benefit recipiency and non-standard employment is worth taking note of here. As these kinds of arrangements have gained traction, the costs and risks of employment that used to be borne by the employer are being shifted not only to the worker, but also to the public in the form of income supports provided to those whose jobs are not allowing them to meet their basic needs. Unlike the economic outcomes, we see that the associations of health status with non-standard work are far less in evidence. There are likely many reasons for this, and importantly, probably the most important, is that this is a cross-sectional look at both employment and health, and we know that many conditions develop over a long period of time. So given this, the best thing we can do is look at risk factors for the onset of chronic illness and disability. And since this is a survey about work, we look at working conditions. So when we looked at the working conditions that have been associated with risks of serious health outcomes, including ergonomic demands, irregular shifts, and job strain, we found that they were all more common among workers in non-standard employment. So in the end, we found that non-standard jobs are not generally more desirable. They are less economically beneficial, and they come with working conditions that put workers at risk for long-term health consequences. So this talk is both a summary of the findings of the California Work and Health Survey, and I do want to mention that we just scratched the surface of the data that we collected. If you are interested, I would recommend that you look at our website. You can see more about the data that we collected, and we also make it available to the public for analyses. If you have a particular interest, you can go to our website. Okay, enough for our plug there. But this talk has also been a prologue for the rest of the conference. So over the coming days, we'll be offering a deeper exploration of the current work climate, discussing ways to improve worker well-being, and really focusing on the perspectives and the voices of workers. So we do hope that you'll stay tuned. A couple of thanks, many thanks to our survey participants, to those who helped us in other ways in developing the survey, to our funders at NIOSH Total Worker Health Program. Very much shout out to our co-investigators and staff, and to everybody else who helped us carry out the survey. With that, I will turn this over to Victor Rubin, who will be a moderator for this question and answer session for both the talk that Lorena Gonzalez gave and my talk.